千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. I would like to get back into Tao Te Ching chapter 80. Previously, we talked about the Chinese characters for the title of this chapter, translated as the small country. And as we talked about before, this chapter, chapter 80, and the next one, 81, these are the concluding chapters of the entire Tao Te Ching, and that's what makes it very important. This is going to conclude both Tao Jing, which is the book of the Tao, that's the first 37 chapters, and De Jing, the book of virtue, which goes from chapter 38 to 79. What is the chapter about? What does it look like? Here is the chapter for which we did a sectional analysis previously. We were able to identify 4 sections. Sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see in this slide the repeating characters in the original and the corresponding translations into English. This will give you a pretty good idea, I think, of identifying the sections. In the first section, it starts out with the main idea. Small country, few people. This is how Lao Tzu describes an ideal place of the Tao. And he begins by describing the people, how they have weapons, but they do not use them. They regard death seriously. They do not move away. That's the introductory section of chapter 80. Then there's a poetic construction in section 2, where Lao Tzu talks about the people, despite having means of transportation, they don't need to take them. Despite having weapons, they don't need to display them. Then, in section 3, Lao Tzu talks about the way that the people live simply. And we'll talk about that in much greater detail in our discussion today. In the last section, Lao Tzu talks about the relationship among the people, the neighbors, how they treat one another, how they coexist peacefully, harmoniously. And again, we'll talk about that in greater detail. For now, I want to do a quick recap of the first part of chapter 80. One of the important things we talked about was the second line there, where it says, let them have many weapons. So in the recap, let me just briefly review what we talked about. And the reason why I focus on it is because of the possibility of 2 different interpretations. The characters in question, I've singled out 3 of them. The character between them is the apostrophe S. So this is talking about the tools, that's the last character, of, and then 2 characters. The first one there in the middle of the line, the third character, it means 10 or 10 times. So you see in parentheses the modern version of that character and then the ancient version to the left of it. Same thing with the character that follows. It means 100 or 100 times. And again, you see the modern version in parentheses and then the ancient version to the left of it. When we talk about tens and hundreds, some would interpret that to mean many, numerous. And then there's the apostrophes, and then there's the tools. So one interpretation is to say that the people have many labor-saving devices, tools. Then they go on to say, in a large society with many people, one would obviously need more tools to help them navigate the complexity of the society. And that's everything from the appropriate, proper clothing, ceremonial attire, ritual implements, ornaments, tools for making a living, etc. And then this interpretation goes on to say, because Lao Tzu is focusing on a small community with few people rather than a large society with many, in a small place, there would be no need for many tools. And that's the reason why Lao Tzu says they have many tools but don't need to use them. Now, this explanation is a little forced and unnecessary. The reason is because when you live in a simpler world, you simply don't need to have many complex tools in the first place. So why even talk about having many tools but not use them? The many tools that are not being used would simply become useless clutter. And we know the Tao has an emphasis on decluttering, on simplifying, which is the opposite of what is being implied here in this interpretation. So a better explanation is to look at these characters that you see in this slide. As I pointed out before, the 10 and the 100 can mean military organization. How does that work? Well, if you look at the ancient form of the character, in addition to the modern form, it's got a radical to the left side. A radical, quote unquote, is part of a Chinese character. It could be the top part, the bottom part, the left part, or the right part. In any of those cases, the term, the academic term for that is a radical. So the characters that you see here, whether it's 10 or 100, they have the same radical to the left-hand side of the character. You can see that in this slide. That character is person. It means 人, which in this context would be men, plural. Therefore, when you put that character next to the character for 10, that would be 10 men. Put it next to 100, that would be 100 men. And that's what leads to the other interpretation that there's many ancient commentaries saying, pointing out that these characters in ancient times were used as part of the military manual to describe organizations of soldiers, which were men back in those days. So the 10 men, that would be a small military unit, what we might call a team or a squad today. It's a group of 10 soldiers. 10 of these squads together will be a military company. A company typically today will be a couple hundred soldiers grouped together. In ancient China, this military unit will be a group of 10 squads, 10 times 10, 100 soldiers. So that's what's being depicted. That's what's being depicted here. This is why weapons is the classical interpretation for tools from the ancient commentary. When I say ancient commentary, I talked about before that these were commentary that date back as far as about 2,000 years ago, a few centuries after the time of Lao Tzu. When you put these characters together, it just means military units in general. The tools of the military units or the army are naturally weapons. This second interpretation makes more sense. It is saying the people have weapons but do not need to use them. That's just another way to say you're prepared for battle. But that is the very reason why you don't need to go into battle, because in ancient times, as today, attackers usually pick targets that are unprepared because they are easy victories. So now this makes a great deal of sense in the context of the historical period in which Lao Tzu wrote the original manuscript of the Tao Te Ching. It was the warring stage period. Many armies battling back and forth across the landscape. Many people, peasants, becoming victims as collateral damage for those wars and battles. It would therefore be natural for Lao Tzu to say, in the ideal situation, the people living in an ideal place will have the means to protect themselves, so they would not become unprepared victims of roaming armies battling across. This is also addressing a bigger issue. People who chose the tools interpretation, not weapons, they prefer that interpretation because they felt that Lao Tzu should never be saying that the ideal place is where people have a lot of weapons. They feel that is kind of odd. And I will tell everybody now that it's not so strange when you think about the Tao approach to peace. This is the slide that we talked about last time. The idea that people are keeping the tools of warfare, weapons, leads naturally and is aligned with the Tao approach to peace. For you see, the Tao is peaceful, but not pacifistic. The greatest warriors from Chinese history were all students of the Tao, without exception. They might be devastating on the battlefield, but they much prefer to not use their deadly skills at all. They all aspire to be known for being honorable and not known for killing. So this slide illustrates the different approaches to be peaceful. The one that we may be more familiar with is that of the conscientious objector. People who object to violence in any form. In the Bible, it says to turn the other cheek. On the left-hand side of this slide, I have the quote from the King James Version. of the Bible. The complete quote starts out saying, and this is from Jesus, "But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." And in contemporary times, this is interpreted as an overall teaching to not seek revenge, rather than a literal sense, like, be the punching bag when it comes to hand-to-hand combat. Now, the Tao approach is on the right-hand side. As you can see, it's different. And we talked about sensing potential attack, give a wide berth if possible. This is actually incorporated in one of the chapters of the Tao Te Ching, as we talked about last time. That same chapter also talks about stopping an attack before it starts. And then goes on to redirecting attack once it starts, handle it while it's still small, stop further attacks with as little force as possible. When you look at this process over here on the right-hand side, originating from ancient China, the steps outlined here are straight up incorporated into martial arts. As you can see, this is based on what actually happens in reality. Now, you can see signs or manifestations of this everywhere. For instance, some of you already know that Bruce Lee had his own martial arts, Jeet Kune Do, which is Cantonese for the way of the intercepting fist. That's actually the second bullet there that you see, to stop an attack before it starts, to intercept the fist before it has a chance to gather strength and hit you. It may not be so well known that Bruce Lee was an avid student of the Tao as well. He was definitely dedicated, and do you know what translation he used? That's a trick question. The answer is none, because he grew up with a Chinese education in the classics. He could read the original, he could read the commentaries, as I do routinely. He did not need any translations. He did not necessarily need like a favorite translation from among the different translations. So this is what the Tao is about, and there's even more to the process. Like a warrior of peace would be very interested in making friends instead of enemies. So even after an attack is stopped, the warrior will be reaching out the hands of friendship, trying to make a connection, trying to turn enemies into allies instead. So there's a lot more to that. For now, just keep in mind that the Tao approach to peace is not at all contradictory to what we're reading here in chapter 80. Lao Tzu is describing the Tao approach, which is peace through strength, to be prepared. And then this is the last slide that we ended up on previously. This slide is talking about how in this ideal place, the people have a healthy regard of death. They treat death seriously. And therefore, they would be very reluctant to leave the safety and security of this place. This is the place where peace prevails, where people are safe and secure. They prepare themselves against disasters. When I say disasters, I mean natural disasters as well as man-made disasters. We talked about weapons, and those were preparations against man-made disasters known as wars and battles. And in such a place, people enjoy prosperity. No one goes hungry. There wouldn't be starvation as a disaster that you have to flee. And therefore, people regarded leaving such a place as a risky endeavor. And this is further emphasized in the following lines. All of this makes particular sense when we take the era, the time that the Tao Te Ching was written, the Warring States period, into consideration. We know that in times of chaos, those poor peasants had no choice but to flee. They had to abandon everything. So of course, it makes absolute sense, Lao Tzu would say, in the ideal place, they don't have to do that. So Lao Tzu goes on to talk about this with great emphasis. He's got two lines here that continue the thought process from lines 4 and 5. Line 4 says, let the people regard death seriously and not migrate far away. That's line 5. This goes into line 6. Although they have boats and chariots, they have no need to take them. So you can see from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, it's one thought. And so what is being said here is that people back in those days, in this ideal place, they had means of transportation. They had their boats and chariots. They could also use them for entertainment. They live quiet lives. There's no threat of invading armies because this was the ideal place, not like the rest of war-torn ancient China. And therefore, they do not need these vehicles as a means of escape. So that makes sense too. This goes on to the other point about weapons, the one that we were just talking about. Line 8 and 9, line 8 says, although they have armors and weapons, line 9, they have no need to display them. This makes it clear that the previous line about tools, the implements of war, was indeed about that. There's no need to use them, therefore there's no need to display them. So these lines continue the thought process from 2 and 3. 2 and 3 say, let them have many weapons, but not use them. So it's all together as one thought, separated by the thoughts in regards to transportation. So this is saying people have armors and weapons just in case. You always want to be ready. You always want to be prepared, just in case. And as before, as Lao Tzu pointed out, the people in this ideal place live quiet lives. There's no threat of invading armies, so they don't need to put their armors and weapons on display. So now I think we have the structure pretty clear. This is painting a vivid picture of what happened back in those days if such a place existed. Potential invaders would know well in advance that the people in such a place would be well armed. They would know that they would not be able to trample over the peasants like they do everywhere else. And the people, for their part, it is good enough for them to know that the knowledge of their preparation is already widespread. They don't need to pose with weapons. There's no posing with weapons in the land of Tao because it really just gratifies the ego. It serves no other useful purpose. It would be a sign of insecurity and overcompensation, perhaps overcompensating the fear of a possible war. Now we have enough information to tie it all together, to look at the bigger picture, to make sure we really see the structure of these ancient lines. First, as before, I want to encircle lines from 4 to 7. This is where people regard death seriously, so they don't move far away. They don't migrate far away. They don't need to flee like refugees. Although they have boats and chariots, they don't need to take them. They don't need to use them as the means of escape. So this is the transportation part. And then wrapping around this, we've got lines 2, 3, 8, and 9. All about weapons. No need to use them. Although they have them, they don't even need to display them. So as opposed to transportation, this is about protection. And you can see how the structure works when we show it like this. And right above this, right above line 2, line 1 is the introductory line, the representative line of this place. It's the small country with few people. So now I think we are ready to go into the section below this, starting with line 10. Let's take a look at what it says. Line 10 says, let the people return to tying knots and using them. So that's a literal translation of this line. I'm singling out 2 characters there to talk about what they mean. So those 2 characters are from the middle of the line, and the first character singled out is to tie, like to tie knots. And the second character there, that's the character for ropes. Could be rope or ropes, singular or plural. Now, in ancient times, and even before ancient times, in primitive times, ropes have been used in creative ways ever since their invention. Different knots were used as reminders in primitive times, and this was very useful before the invention of writing. Before writing, people could and did absolutely make marks on a piece of wood to serve as reminders, to make records, to count. They could also use symbols, usually symbols they invented themselves, pictographs like little icons that they could recognize as markings on wood, on a wooden surface. Over time, these pictographs evolved into common characters, the beginning of the ancient Chinese characters. Now, there's going to be times when they needed to remember something that there might not be pieces of wood or cutting tool like a knife handy where they could carve into it, but there might be lengths of ropes lying around the house. Hence, the widespread practice of tying different kinds of knots to remind people of different things. All of this together just means that tying knots represent simple solutions in this context. Then the entire line says, let the people return to tying knots and using them. So let's take a look at the entire line. To return to tying knots, it just means going back to the simple life. So this is metaphorically speaking, it's not Lao Tzu advocating, let's forget all about writing, let's go back to tying knots. This is just a way to say we need to let go of complexity and simplify our lives. And I find that this message is all the more relevant to our lives today. And the reason is because, as you know and I know, our modern lives are pretty complex. We live lives that are busy, stressful, sometimes full of tension, oftentimes way too complex. And this means we can also benefit from going back to the simpler and easier life. Is this possible? I would say yes. And sometimes all it takes is just a shift in the way that we look at everything. Now, I want to remind everyone for this particular teaching that the Tao is never about extremes. It isn't about some sort of extreme simplicity where you let go of absolutely everything. It's not about being extremely minimalistic. Rather, this is all about being simpler than the way things are today. It's about reducing the complexity that we have right now. And oftentimes, for most of us, simplifying even a little bit can help us derive a lot of benefits. And if we continue doing that, it becomes a gradual process. It unfolds gradually over time. It becomes part of our cultivational practice. And that process of simplification, that too is a journey of 1,000 miles. It is meant to be taken one small step at a time. So I want to suggest to everyone that this is not a call to declutter everything immediately. Rather, this is a suggestion to say that you can start small. Rather than to organize and declutter the entire house, I would even say start with one drawer. To open that up and see what you can organize or can let go of. But back to Lao Tzu. When Lao Tzu looks at simplification and living the simpler, better life, he talked about it in multiple categories, 4 categories specifically. This is what we end up with on lines 11 and 12. Lao Tzu breaks down the simple life in 4 categories: food, clothing, home, and customs. Line 11 says, savor their food, admire their clothes. So this is the first 2 categories. In living the simple life, the people enjoy their food. The meals in the simple life were simply prepared. People enjoy them despite the food not being very elaborate because they knew the extravagant and exotic delicacies are not necessarily the best. People use simple, basic ingredients that were seasonal and naturally delicious because they're in season. Such foods happen to be the most healthy. So we're talking about wholesome, whole foods, everyday foods that are filling and satisfying. Taking a cue from this, Tao cultivators also have a more simplifying approach to nutrition. In general, we want to move toward minimally processed whole foods. As I mentioned, these happen to be the most healthy of all. And we want to practice moderation in our consumption of the foods. Now, when we talk about food and when we talk about people's attitude toward life and death, here it is appropriate for me to bring up the overall comparison and contrast that Lao Tzu has noted and observed. He noted a connection between how people lived to how they looked at life. So different perspectives on death. And remember, in the Tao, life and death are part of the same thing, two sides of the same coin. So back in chapter 75 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu pointed out about the opposites of the ideal place, people who live under tyranny. In 75, line 1, at the very beginning, it starts out saying the people's hunger is due to the excess of the ruler's taxation. So this is what happens when you live under tyranny. And then further down in line 7, Lao Tzu wrote that the people's disregard for death, or they regarded death lightly, and that was all due to the glut and the ruler's pursuit of life. So the ruling class lived a good life, and the people no longer cared if they live or die, they just wanted it to end. This is basically the beginning of their uprising. So people would rebel against a tyrant because, well, they were hungry and they regarded death with this lightness, this disregard. They don't care anymore. In the ideal place, described here in chapter 80, it's the opposite. Here, we have gone through these lines. So last time, we talked about how the people regard death seriously rather than disregard. And then that was the reason they chose not to migrate far away. Here, we talk about people living the simple life, able to savor their food, have a satisfying meal as opposed to going hungry. Living the simple life like that as the opposite of living under tyranny. So I wanted to set these up side by side so you see the difference. What happens when people are hungry and disregard death? And then the opposite, what happens when people are able to savor their food and regard death seriously? These are connected. And I wanted to help you connect the dots. So let's continue on. The second category that Lao Tzu talked about was clothing. In living the simple life, the people like the simple ways they dress. This is because they realized that luxurious, grandiose clothing aren't necessarily the best. They were quite aware that in a materialistic society, the luxurious, grandiose clothing were usually regarded as the best. Our equivalent today would be like designer labels, dresses, suits that cost thousands of dollars. Now, in cultivating the Tao, we're not saying those should be thrown away. There's certainly a place for that kind of attire, but we note that they are not for everyday casual use. Everyday living, the primary requirement is to be comfortable. Therefore, it is the simple attire appropriate for the season, the weather, that is the most comfortable. Because of that, Tao cultivators have certain preferences. When you get deeper into the Tao, you're going to naturally move toward modest, understated, and elegant attire. So such clothing would not be very complex at all. There's no clashing colors, no day glow kind of colors that call attention to itself, and there's also no need to wear slogans, advertise different symbols. There's no statements that they need to wear on their t-shirts. Now, if you have them, that's okay. I don't want to get in trouble with a lot of people. I know that there are people who perhaps have just discovered the Tao, and they are full of enthusiasm. They want to shout it out from the rooftops, so they will wear something that's got Tao symbols on them. All I'm saying is that there's no need. In fact, it is better for the Tao cultivator to draw not a whole lot of attention to themselves. So moving on to the third category, which is about living in homes. Line 12 says, content in their homes, happy in their customs. This just means, the first part says, in living the simple life, the people feel content in their homes. They realize that huge, imposing mansions are not necessarily the best. And again, in materialistic society, a huge mansion would be seen as the best, but not in the ideal place of the Tao. In such a place, your own home sweet home is just the right size for you, not too big, not too small. So in terms of living, Tao cultivators have preferences as well. They are preferring more open spaces with less clutter, and they have minimalist yet functional and practical furniture. So this is in keeping with their approach to food and clothing. Now, when we talk about open spaces and less clutter, I am aware that it's a challenge many people have. I personally know of people who have lived through times of poverty, and therefore they tend to hoard everything. I also know friends who tend to gather a lot of cheaply made disposable items that don't last. Now, the result of all of the above would be a lot of clutter, not just physical clutter in your environment, but also mental clutter. This is why Tao cultivators tend toward the opposite. In the things they own, they want quality, they want utility and durability, things that last, higher quality things that will serve them well for years to come. And then the fourth and last category that Lao Tzu talked about is in regards to customs. In living the simple life, the people happily practice their customs. And these customs are simple traditions. These are not things that are necessarily fashionable. They knew that elaborate ceremonial customs would not necessarily be the best. Rather, the preference of the people in this ideal place is for respectful, traditional, simple customs, because that's frankly all that is needed for the social graces. So as a result, taking a cue from this, Tao cultivators, we ourselves are inclined to refrain from following fads or unconventional practices. So the unconventional practices might be ways for some to try to get attention. When there's an obsession, when there's an attachment on gaining the attention of others, that speaks to a deeper issue, a lack, a void to be filled with attention, which tends to be a bottomless pit, like you can never get enough attention. And that is a problem that we want to address in Tao cultivation. In the Tao, the focus is on courtesy rather than complex and rigorous forms. There's no need to study on how to be very precise in a particular custom. If the respect and courtesy is there, That is the important thing. So these are the 4 categories that Lao Tzu covered when he spoke about returning to the simple life, using tying knots in ropes as a metaphor. Let's continue on past line 12 of Tao Te Ching chapter 80. Now that we have talked about the 4 categories that Lao Tzu focused on when it comes to living the simple life, I want to provide some, what I hope to be helpful suggestions. This is for your journey towards simplicity. It is a journey that different people are on at in different phases. It may be a journey you have yet to start, or it is a journey you have already started, and therefore the thing to do is just to continue on that journey. I find that the helpful mindset for that journey is to cultivate awareness. Awareness of, as an example, we ourselves taking on responsibility as the primary source of complexity. So what role have we played in our lives, in our own struggles and striving? Well, possibly a central role. Possibly we ourselves are the biggest cause of complexity in our lives. If so, awareness of that is the first step in tamping it down, in reducing that complexity. And the other question to ask is, what attachments are we grasping onto? What attachments exist today in our lives? The attachments that you and I cling to, they also happen to be the sources that cause suffering. For instance, when there's emotional baggage, when there's dependency on someone else, a factor out of your control, the more you grasp onto it, the more painful thoughts and or memories will bubble up in your consciousness. Becoming aware of that, becoming aware of those attachments will help you let go. And then another question, a clarifying question, is what is the ultimate goal? What is my purpose? This is to reconnect with your inner clarity. What exactly am I trying to accomplish here? What am I trying to accomplish in this lifetime? The clarity that you gain in answering those kinds of questions, that clarity has a magical effect. It clears up the distractions. It quiets down the noise. It streamlines the complexity. So it is a very helpful mindset to ask clarifying questions, to become aware of attachments, and also becoming aware of we ourselves as the cause of our troubles. There's also going to be helpful habits that I can suggest for people to take into consideration on your path or your journey towards simplicity. One habit that's become very helpful to me personally is to get into this habitual pattern to reduce the many to the few and reduce the few to the one. It's a process or prioritization. That is to say, when you're facing many, it's going to be confusing, it's going to be disorienting. If you then spend a moment to reduce the many to the few, out of all these different things in front of me, what are the sum, what are the few of them that are the most important, that should be prioritized? So that can be very helpful. Then, reducing from the few to the one is even more helpful. It is helping to answer the next question. Out of all the things that I have to do, what is the one thing that will make all others easier or unnecessary? Experience has taught me that no matter what kind of complexity I am facing, if I were to look through the eyes of the Tao, I would always be able to see the one thing that will make other things a lot easier, and sometimes even completely eliminated as not being necessary at all. The benefit is tremendous. It is a way to declutter the mind. So the previous part about the helpful mindset is to let go of negativity. Now we are talking about a process of decluttering that is not just physical, but also applied to the mental aspects of life. And continuing on to talk about the mental issues, I want to suggest to everyone to pay attention to the small details in life. It is in the small things that we gain insights into the big things. Details tend to be overlooked when your day is filled with complexity so that it flies by in a blur. Then, well, what have you missed? What are some cool things that you missed out on by going too fast? It is perhaps time to slow down and pay attention to the details. And even more than slowing down, I would take it even further and say, stop, pause, hit that pause button. Stop to smell the roses. All the hustle, all the tension, the stress. I want to ask everyone to be very intentional in creating a break for yourself. Create a break that gives your inner self a break. A time for you. A pause that refreshes. So these, I find, are all very helpful in moving toward simplicity, as recommended by Lao Tzu. Now let's move on to talk about line 13. Here we are getting into the final section, the fourth section of this chapter. Line 13 says, neighboring countries see one another. Let me break down the characters for you. 4 characters. First character literally means neighbor. Second character, 国, means countries. In ancient times, this will be kingdoms. Scholars would say states. And then the third character means mutual, each other, one another. And then the last character there is to see, to visually be able to see something. When you string them all together, you get the surface meaning presented in the next bullet here. Kingdoms are within visual range of each other. They can see each other. This being able to see, it's just a way to say close by, nearby, not far apart. Then you want to remember that in the Tao Te Ching, when Lao Tzu talks about a ruler, he's actually talking about you being in charge of your life. When Lao Tzu talks about kingdom, country, state, nation, he's talking about your life, your existence. Therefore, we're able to map this to the life that we live. And when we map it to our lives, we can see, Lao Tzu says, we should not isolate ourselves. that is, we are one of the neighboring kingdoms that is able to see other neighboring kingdoms. It's a way to say Tao cultivators are part of a community. They do not need to live like hermits, far away from civilization. All of this is very similar to our everyday expressions, like when we talk about something not being too far away, we say that, oh, that location is within striking distance. Sometimes we say, oh, it's within spitting distance. You know, we don't mean that literally. We just mean that they're not too far away. And similar expressions like, oh, it's a stone's throw away, meaning it's close by. Now, we don't use those expressions precisely or literally. We may talk about something that's only a mile away as being like a stone's throw away, even though none of us can throw a stone 1 mile in distance. So back to the Tao Te Ching, this is talking about how people do not live far away from one another, so far that they cannot see their neighbors. The next line drives home the point. Line 14. Line 14 says, hear the sounds of roosters and dogs from one another. Let's break down this line as well. We've got 6 characters in this line. The first character is chicken, and no other way really to translate that. Chicken, rooster, hen. And then the second character is dog. Yes, the ancient Chinese domesticated animals, so they definitely had dogs. And then there's the third character is the apostrophe S. Fourth character means sound or sounds, plural. Next to last character is mutual. That's the mutual character again, used multiple times in this chapter. And then the very last character there is here. It's a counterpart to see. So Lao Tzu is basically saying that the neighbors are close by, so not just within visual range, but also within hearing range, which is even a little bit closer. And that, of course, depends on the volume of the noise. This does not, however, mean that in this ideal place, people are disturbed by noisy neighbors. It doesn't mean that at all. Lao Tzu is simply saying that people live close enough together that they're able to interact. They're able to greet one another and help one another. If there's something wrong, they can detect it and they can come to your aid. They can help one another in times of need. They can watch out for one another. So this is part of living in the ideal place, neighbors who mutually provide assistance. And we can see from our own experience that this is very true. We still have something like this in small towns where if some sort of conflict or accident has occurred in your home, a neighbor may hear it and come over just to make sure, hey, I just want to make sure everything's okay. Is everything okay? So within the context of this chapter, the idea overall is that people band together to deal with disasters. And as I mentioned before, that disaster could be natural, could be man-made. It could be the roof is leaking, or the house has been flooded, or man-made, like there's a marauding band of armed men coming this way. We need to prepare for them, and so on. Let's tackle the last 2 lines of this chapter. Line 15, the people until they grow old and die. So this line is subject to misinterpretation as well, because the next line says, do not go back and forth with one another. So I'll talk about the misconception or the misinterpretation in a moment. For now, I want to focus on just line 15. 4 characters. The first character there is the character for people. The second character, until. The third character is old. It's Lao, just like Laozi, the old master. And then the last character is the character for death, or die, or dying. So what does it mean when you string them together and you see people until old die? Well, it's basically the translation. The people until they grow old and die. When you translate from Chinese to English, you oftentimes need to add a few connective words that are not explicit in the original. What does it mean? Well, it is saying that people who live in this ideal place, they live all their lives in this place, in happiness and stability. The stability means they don't need to move around, they don't need to move away. And this is exactly as noted in lines 4 to 7. They have no need to go anywhere else. Just to remind everybody, these are the lines again. Let the people regard death seriously and not migrate far away. Although they have boats and chariots, they have no need to take them. So that's why they live in this place until they grow old and die. So I think that makes perfect sense. Now, let's talk about the misinterpretation of the last line, the final line. The last line is translated as do not go back and forth with one another. Even the translation is subject to misinterpretation. And that's because the translation that I have done is translating the original exactly. Ambiguity included. If the original is ambiguous and subject to misinterpretation, the translation should be exactly that, to preserve every element of the original as much as possible. Let's go ahead and break it down, the characters. The first character means no. The second character is the character for mutual, each other, one another. And then the last 2 characters, there's the character for go, like to go someplace, and then the character for come, coming from someplace. Together, it will be coming and going, basically. So there's no mutual coming and going, is what the line seems to say. This is what is subject to possible misinterpretation. Misinterpretation, not necessarily by translators from Chinese to English, but by Chinese native speakers themselves. That is because in modern Mandarin, this expression, 不相往来, which could also be said as 不相来往, with the last 2 characters switching places. It means no social visits, no social interactions with one another. And it's a negative context. It means someone who is being barred or isolated from interacting with someone else or intentionally ignoring someone else. To have nothing more to do with that person is what it means in modern Mandarin. This, however, is not the ancient meaning. In this context, from 2,500 years ago, it doesn't mean that the people don't go back and forth socially. What it specifically means is that they don't go back and forth in a negative way. If we were to use the modern Mandarin interpretation of that, it would actually contradict the idea that we just talked about of being nearby, mutual assistance, mutual support. How can that be if this means no interactions whatsoever. Like when we say, you are dead to me, I will no longer speak with you or do anything with you. That would be a contradiction. The actual meaning is no interfering with one another. There's still the mutual support and assistance. That doesn't change, but there's no friction or contention. So the back and forth here is petty conflicts, like, oh, you got me good, well, I'm gonna get you back. I'm gonna get you back for what you did to me. I'm gonna even the score with you. That kind of back and forth. Or you interfered with me, now I'm going to butt into your business to repay you in kind. How do you like a dose of your own medicine? That's a petty conflict. That's what we see a lot. That's what doesn't exist in this ideal place, where people know how to get along and have a harmonious coexistence. That's what makes it ideal. So now, what I would like to do is to bring everything together by showing you the meaning in the structure of Tao Te Ching, chapter 80. There are 6 main characteristics that Lao Tzu uses to describe the ideal place. First is going to be just line 1. The ideal place is a small community that is not crowded. It's small enough that you can get to know people on an individual basis. You can make friends and have that friendship last for an entire lifetime. And then the second main point is what we have talked about. It's in the middle. It's from line 4 to line 7. People regard death seriously. They do not migrate far away. Even though they have boats and chariots, they don't need to use them. So that point is about, this is a good place, so nobody wants to leave. People would prefer to stick around. They don't need to go anywhere. Anywhere else would not be as ideal as this place. So people will stay there with stability. Then we talked about the next one, about weapons, about having weapons. It's basically saying these are the people who are ready and prepared. They can take care of themselves. They can see to their own protection. They're perfectly able to protect themselves, and this is the reason why they don't have to, because they're able to. So thus far, from points 1, 2, and 3, you can see the beginning of this ideal place. A place that is tight-knit, where you get to know other people, a place where you know you have a good thing going on, and therefore you're reluctant to go anywhere else. And then a place where you have the ability and the means to maintain the peace and prosperity. Let's continue on to point number 4. Point number 4 is going to be the next 3 lines. And the 3 lines are all about living and enjoying the simple life. That's the 4th major characteristic. Then the last 2 lines there, the next 2 lines, 13 and 14, are about, as we discussed, nearby neighbors supporting one another. Now, let me point out a couple of things. Point number 4 is a call back to point number 2. People live and enjoy the simple life. They are content in their homes. To say that they're content in their homes is the same as saying that they know they are in a good place, they don't want to go somewhere else, which is point number 2. Then point number 5, where people talk about being with others, not being far away from them. It's a callback to point number 1. It's a small community that is not crowded, so you can really get to know people on an individual basis. Then final point number 6 is the last 2 lines. Last 2 lines is basically saying that people live in harmony with one another all their lives. This is a callback as well to point number 5, because we're talking about people living in harmony with their neighbors, supporting, helping neighbors. That's number 5. And number 4, point number 4, contains one element, happy in their customs. These are social customs that are the lubricating factor in personal interactions. So they contribute to the harmony among the people in this ideal place. So that's a callback to number 4. But this, you can see, this is boiling down the 16 lines of chapter 80 to the 6 major points that Lao Tzu wanted to describe. Now, this whole idea of the ideal place is not unique to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu was one of many sages who studied the Tao back in the old days. Other sages, some before him, some came after him, they studied from the same Tao. Everyone knew that there was a vision of the ideal place from the Tao perspective. The Tao incorporates a vision for the world as it can be, the world as it could be. So Lao Tzu was not the only one. Other sages, as I mentioned, some came before him, some after. A prominent sage who came after Lao Tzu, who, according to legend, is a disciple of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu was a master, a mentor, a teacher to this other sage who was a younger man by multiple decades, and that was Confucius. You might not have heard about this, that Confucius regarded Lao Tzu as his master, but that is how it's presented in legends. Now, when Confucius studied from the same source, it is the same ancient Tao that predated both Confucius and Lao Tzu by thousands of years. Specifically, we often talk about how Lao Tzu lived 2,500 years ago. We forget that the tradition of the Tao was before him by at least more than 2,000 years. So roughly 4,800 years ago, that was the time of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. That was the time of I Ching, the Book of Changes. That is the source. That's the mother lode of ancient wisdom that was mined by Lao Tzu and Confucius alike. Now, everybody studied the Tao and understood it in their own unique ways, with their own unique perspectives. So Confucius had his own way of describing the ideal place. He called it 大同世界, the world of 大同. So 大同, those are the 2 characters that you see in the heading of this particular slide. The first character, 大, it means big, vast, great. 同 is togetherness, sometimes translated as commonwealth or unity in this case. So the emphasis here is that they drew from the same source. When you understand how things actually work in that sense, you then are no longer so taken by some explanations in academia about how Lao Tzu and Confucius were at odds with one another, that they represented arch enemies. That's absolute nonsense. They probably were master students, master disciples, or student teacher. And then what happened is that when Confucius learned these ancient Tao concepts, he also discussed those concepts with his own students. These were recorded in Li Ji, the Book of Rites, one of the ancient classics. And Da Tong turned out to be one of the most influential concepts from Chinese culture. What I would like to do, I never had a really good chance to explain what Da Tong is all about. So this is the time for us to do that. Let me give you what the ancient text looks like. And it's much more important in this case for you to get the idea, the concepts, the meaning, rather than character by character explanation of how the translation was derived. So let me provide you with the translation along with some commentary. First, it says, when the great Tao prevails, the world is a commonwealth shared by all. Two things to talk about there. Number one, it specifically mentions the great Tao. At the time of Lao Tzu and Confucius, they both considered themselves to be students of the Tao, same source. Point number two, just like the vision of Lao Tzu, Confucius is talking about something, a commonwealth that is shared by all, that nobody's left out. Everybody gets to benefit. It's for the group, not for the individual. And you can see that there's an emphasis in Lao Tzu as well to talk about more than just one person. Then they choose the virtuous and capable as leaders. They promote trust and cultivate goodwill. So the original text is not specific as to pronouns. So this could be the virtuous and capable are chosen. Chosen by whom? If we say they, the people, that's actually an early expression of democracy. Now, it could be reinterpreted as divine will, like monarchy. Either way, this is talking about how only the virtuous and capable should lead people into this commonwealth. In modern times, we can read democracy into that and say, in a democratic process, the people choose the virtuous and capable. Next, thus, people do not regard only their own parents as parents, nor do they regard only their own children as children. What does that mean? It means this is a close, tight-knit community. This is a village, so to speak, where the elders belong to everyone, where the children belong to everyone, regardless of who their parents are. This is actually something that's widespread in Asian societies. So you will see from time to time where in Asian cultures, in ancient times, Confucian ideals has spread throughout all of Asia, not just ancient China. So for the Asians, tight-knit community where friends of your parents, all of them are uncles and aunts. And all the kids, well, they are the children of the village, even if they're not your own flesh and blood, you would treat them as if they were. This is the genesis of that concept. Then we have the old are cared for until death. The adults are gainfully employed, and the children are nurtured. No one is left out of the picture. In modern times, we would say all the different age demographics are well taken care of. Then we have widows, widowers, orphans, childless seniors, the disabled and diseased are all taken care of. So it's not just the different age demographics, it's also talking about the people who are bereft, people who have lost loved ones. If so, the community is there for them. The people who are disadvantaged, diseased perhaps, handicapped perhaps they're disabled in some way, the community is just as there for them as they are for those who are healthy. So everyone is taken care of. It goes on. Next, we have men have their proper roles and women have their families. So of course, this passage comes from ancient times when men were expected to take on work that might be dangerous or labor intensive, while women were expected to stay home and care for family members. So this is reading to be a little bit dated from our modern sensibilities in the here and now. Today, as civilization progresses, we are definitely seeing gender roles evolve, and in many cases, no longer fit traditional delineations. So a modern reinterpretation of these lines would be that everyone, including men and women, have their proper roles. And it could be internal or external to the family unit. Women can and often have proper roles in the workplace. Men can and often have proper roles within the family. Continuing on. People hate to see a resource thrown away on the ground, but they do not necessarily keep it for themselves. So I was raised on these concepts. I hate to waste anything myself. At the same time, this is also saying that people are not necessarily selfish in hoarding resources for themselves. So there's no wasting and there's no hoarding. People, this goes on, they hate to not do their own work, but they do not necessarily work for themselves. So again, this is talking about the fulfillment and satisfaction when people are put to work doing what they're good at, what they're capable of. They don't necessarily work for themselves, they are working for the community as a whole. Not necessarily just in self-interest, although the Tao is not opposed to advancing your self-interest, but there's always a part of the work that contributes to the overall well-being of the group. So because of all of the above, we have the next part. Therefore, conspiracies do not thrive. Robberies, thefts, and criminal activities do not occur. And this continues on. Thus, people do not need to shut their doors when they go out. This is talking about how this ideal place, 大同, the great unity, is a very safe place with virtually no crime, virtually no violence among people. Safety and security above all. And last line, this is called 大同, the great unity. Now this is what Confucius expressed. So you may be wondering, well, it doesn't read like the small country with few people. It seems to have different takes on what the ideal place ought to be. But then we say that they drew from the same source, right? What is the commonality between the two? Well, in the typical teaching of chapter 80, it's never really addressed what the commonalities are. We're going to go there right now. You're going to see that it is actually quite easy to look at the two. From Confucius, 礼运大同, from Lao Tzu, 小国寡民. Now, what are the two characters, first of all, before 大同? 礼运, the two characters, the first character means propriety. And the second character means movement. Together, 礼运 is the path of propriety. When you walk on this path, you begin to understand right from wrong, and you move from ignorance to enlightenment. So it is often put together with 大同, the great unity. So what are the commonalities between the concepts expressed by Confucius and the concepts expressed by Lao Tzu? There are three major components that they intersect on. The first one, a strong sense of community. You're going to find that elements in both prominently. The second thing is the emphasis on the good life for one and all. Everybody, all together. Nobody is left out. And then yet another emphasis that is common to both, safety and security. They're just expressed in different ways. So these are the three pillars of the ideal place in the Tao. Take a look at a strong sense of community. Confucius expressed it in his own way, his own perspective, based on his own observations and what he felt would be good. And that is, remember he said, elders and children belong to everyone, that you treat the parents of other people as your own parents, the children of others as your own children. It's the elders and the children of the village, everybody together. And those in need, whether they are bereft, they have lost someone, they're sick, injured, whatever the case may be, they are cared for by the community. The community is there for them. That is a strong community right there. Lao Tzu felt the same. He just talked about it in different ways. Lao Tzu said, well, it's a small place with few people, so you really can get to know the people on an individual basis. Friendships, to Lao Tzu, the more important thing is to know people in depth and not have many shallow friendships where you don't really know the people at all. And in terms of community, the neighbors all provide mutual assistance. This is from the part where Lao Tzu talks about how people live close enough together, they're within visual and hearing range, so they can render mutual assistance. When something goes wrong, members of this community come to your door. Hey, just want to check, is everything okay? That is a strong community right there. Now let's talk about the good life for one and all. Confucius wanted that in his ideal, and he expressed it this way. He said, everyone plays a role, everyone contributes to society. That is to say, people do the work that they're good at, they make the contributions. He also said, resources are not wasted, nor are they hoarded. So that is the good life for one and all. Lao Tzu wanted the good life for one and all as well. He just talked about it differently. He said, everyone lives and enjoys the simple life. The simple life is the good life. And that when people interact with one another, they get along. There's no petty conflicts. There's no petty back and forth. Oh, you got me, I'm going to get you. There's none of that. There's just harmony. Harmony is the good life for one and all. Lastly, the emphasis on safety and security. So Confucius talked about it this way. There's virtually no crime, so people feel safe. What about Lao Tzu? How did he express safety and security? Well, he didn't talk about it in terms of crime. How could you when you're in the warring states and there's armies roaming the landscape? So for Lao Tzu, safety and security, he expressed it as people can take care of themselves. They're able to protect themselves. So I have drawn only the elements from the most accurate translations from both sides, Confucius and Lao Tzu. And you can see through the stylistic differences of the two sages that at the core, the essence of their thoughts and ideals are actually one and the same, and it is the Tao. Lastly, what we should do is to take the three major elements that you see here and apply those elements to our own lives. Here's what it looks like. Remember, we've got community, we've got the good life, we've got safety and security. So let's talk about some ideas. How do we create the ideal place with a strong sense of community? Well, I would suggest start with your immediate environment. That is, in the Tao, you always want to begin by establishing your own harmony within yourself. Once you have that, extend the harmony to your family. And once you have that, extend the harmony from your family to your neighbors, and then from your neighbors to your community. That's what I mean by start with your immediate environment. And I also have respect elders and nurture the young. So this is just about strengthening, building relationships with older people, younger people. The older people can become mentors and guides and advisors. And we already know, you and I already know, connecting with the young is something that can help us connect with our own original childlike nature. That's the Tao. Let's move on to the good life, the good life for all. How do we create that for ourselves? Well, if you were to ask Lao Tzu, he would say the good life is the simple life. Move toward simplifying your life. The more you can simplify your life, the better it becomes. The more joy you can have in that life. Then Confucius would chime in and say, well, you want to play your role, you want to do what you can to contribute to the team. There's a fulfillment and satisfaction there over and beyond what you are compensated for. So the good life is where you can simplify and where you can contribute. So both Lao Tzu and Confucius have advice that we can use. So what about safety and security? Well, in ancient times, that was definitely because it was the time of wars and battles. It was important for people to be able to protect themselves and their loved ones. Today, many of us, not all of us, many of us are fortunate enough to live in a relatively peaceful environment where we don't need to worry about war breaking out. That's not the same for everybody around the world. For us, though, safety and security can still be primary considerations. It just means we need to be prepared for disasters. And remember what I said was disasters could be natural or man-made. We want to be ready for them. We want to take common sense precautions. So that requirement doesn't go away just because we don't have impending wars. And lastly, establish and maintain security for everyone. This is what Confucius would say. He would say that, well, we can all be more secure. There's always room for improvement, especially a lot of us live in places that are not as fortunate as countries that follow Confucian concepts that have very low crime rates. We can all be careful. We can all help establish and maintain security for everybody. So we have talked quite a bit about the implications of the ideal place, the concept of the ideal place in the Tao. And you can see from our discussion that it's quite in-depth. There's a lot of different pieces. We don't have time today to talk about the paraphrase or the full circle. We have to now jump to the summary for our discussion of chapter 80. Part 1 is what we went through last time. So the first item there is similar to what we have just talked about. How do we create the ideal place in our own lives? And suggestions that I talked about before is to limit the scale, start small. And you also want to look at the small in terms of your social circle. That is, it's better to have a few friends that you get to know deeply than to have many friends that you hardly know at all. You want to get to know each individual. And the next item we talked about last time was to be prepared. Have contingencies, have backup plans, have all of your tools ready just in case. Like the ancients, you want to have peace, but you also want to have that peace through strength. This is the Tao approach to peace. And that strength should be hidden and unused. Just like the people in this ideal place, no need to use their weapons, no need to show their weapons. Same with the strength that you possess. Next, let's talk about the summary for today. Establishing a simpler life for yourself. We talked about mindfulness. We talked about consumption. So I suggest expanding your horizons, exploring your options. So when it comes to our world today, technology allows us to gain access to information like never before. We have all the abilities at our fingertips to draw from the collective wisdom of humanity and to take the best ideas for ourselves. And when it comes to clothing, I would suggest that you take a look at your wardrobe, that there may be old clothes that you will never wear again, perhaps clothes that no longer fit. They can be donated, and you can aim for elegant simplicity as Tao cultivators do. What about decluttering? Well, I mentioned that a small beginning is best, like just focusing on a drawer for decluttering and organization. That would really be good enough. The whole simplification journey is a journey of 1,000 miles. You want to do the physical decluttering and also turn your attention to what is in your mind. Is your mind full of outdated ideas that are no longer useful? If so, it's time to look at decluttering the mind as well. And lastly, it's all about harmonious, peaceful coexistence. Be the good neighbor and friend that you would like to have. This is from the last part of chapter 80, where living close to your community, being on hand to help other people is paramount in the Tao. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.